All right, so we are to the point that so far for me has been the trickiest point of making a rug, and that is going around the curve. So you can see I just had braided up to here. This was the strand, this is the rug as it was before I came up this side with this braid. Most of the reviews I've seen, unless I've misread them, just say to keep braiding normally. So do the under, over, under, over, under. Pull this through. Make sure this is all nice, light, and every strand is visible, and then just keep going. I guess you could do that. Some people probably can do that successfully. I have yet to be able to pull that off. Because they say that you can skip lacing through every single one of these if it doesn't line up, but it always lines up neatly for me. Like, these are very clearly defined. So it's no hardship lacing this one through this one if I were to go the normal approach. But when you get to the loop, you need to add an increase anyways, because otherwise these strands going around the outside of the curve just keep getting longer and longer and longer until they're just really too long to work with. They're floppy. The pattern might still look okay. This is what tricked me up, is the pattern still looked great, but these were getting so floppy that, like, down here it's kind of a nice tight weave, but up here it would just be like you could stick 3 fingers between in the gaps. So you have to add an increase anyways, and this is how I have found the best way to make sure that when you go around the curve, the tension doesn't get funny. If the tension does get funny, it might get funny in 2 different ways. The one way is it might curve up like this, and that is a tendency. You can see mine's doing it just a little bit, but luckily with the nature of the t-shirt fabric and stuff like that, as long as it's not a dramatic curve, it should flatten out as you add more weight to the outside of it, or if you just like let gravity do its thing for a little bit. You know that the curve is too much, let's say it's naturally curving this way. If you flip it upside down and press it down, does it buckle and ripple, because if it was a real curve like this and you tried to flatten it, it would have to put that material somewhere and it would look weird. So that's how you can tell if the curve is too much. The other thing that it might do is if you pull really, really tightly or have inconsistent tension, is it might do this, where it kind of buckles intermittently and hides strands between. So a lot of mine, this is how it came out, was it would look okay, but then as I kept braiding, it would start doing stuff like this around the edges, and it wasn't really noticeable until I was really deep, and it was miserable to undo it. So those are the 2 things to look out for. But I think that my approach largely takes care of them. So we have to do an increase here anyway. So let's add our increase. I like to do it before the curve. Some things say to do it here, but I like to do it here. So, this is the other thing, is when you add an increase, the best way to do it, I tried other ways that were stupid, just like kind of trying to neatly knot on a strip to here. But the nicest way is to sew 2 strands together. And this time you don't want the diagonal, you want it to just be a straight line. And then just feed it straight through. And how stinking easy is that? It just looks effortlessly like you added, like 2 lines came out of nowhere. Okay, so here's what I have learned. We now have 8 strands because we started with 6. So braid normally, or weave, or whatever you want to call it. Pull it tight so that everything is well defined. You don't want to pull super tight either, just so that things are the lines are well defined. If you do that, you're doing pretty good. Okay, now here's the trick. Do not tuck this into here. Just don't do it. Next one. Do the same thing. Make sure that's nice and tight. Well, tight enough. Make sure that when you're pulling on this, you don't move where the line is between the 2 different colors, so you don't want it to look funny. And then you still do not tuck it in. And then you do it again. So this is my approach. I braid straight out for a little bit, not tucking it into place. And then, and this is a little bit more art than science, so it depends on the length of the curve, because I imagine that this is going to have to change a bit. I got lost. Okay, so this needs to be under this one. And this one needs to be over that one and under this one. Okay, sorry, my bad. Under, over. But yeah, whenever the curve gets bigger, I expect that this is going to have to be tweaked a little bit so that you basically braid it halfway, attach it, then braid it the other halfway, and then attach it. But I haven't gotten one that big yet. So you can see that it's naturally starting to curve, even though I haven't specifically tried to curve it. And this is where the trick comes in, is these are not super connected. Like, this blue technically corresponds to that blue. This orange technically corresponds to that orange. And this blue to that blue, and this orange to that orange. But if you had laced it through every single one of these, it would make the tension really tight. Like, you could see me just kind of bending it up here, how it naturally wants to buckle here. So if you start like this instead, bend it a little bit, see where it's buckling. So there, that's buckling. Pull that one tight. There, that's buckling a little bit. Pull that one a little bit tighter. Okay, it's not really buckling anymore. Bend it a little bit more. You want to make sure these still line up. But where does it look like it naturally would be a good place to join without buckling more? So if I tried to undo it and ravel that into that one, it would probably buckle here. But it looks like this is a good natural spot. If you do it here, then that's too much spaces with a gap. But this looks like a nice middle ground. So let's pull that one through. Now, and then this one. So that still follows the pattern. We did add this split here, but the pattern is still followed. And you can see this lays nice and flat. Yes, there is actually technically a little bit of a gap here. But that's just kind of necessary for it to lay flat because of the nature of the curves. I learned that from reading an old book about old school rug braiding, the sort where you just braid a normal strand and then sew it together. They call it skips. Whenever they were sewing it together, they would purposefully skip stitches when they're going around here. So do like every other or every third stitch together, sew them together. Because otherwise, if you sewed every single one together, it would buckle. So I figured I'd try the same approach with braiding, and it seemingly has worked masterfully, because you can see it's laying nice and flat and looks pretty good. Once you're done, you could potentially go back, if you don't like the fact that there's these gaps, and sew these together, because at that point all of the tension should be on the rug the way it's going to be forever. And so you could probably sew it in such a way that you won't won't make it suddenly start buckling. But I don't know that it's really necessary if you keep them relatively small. Okay, so that's one tip. That's perhaps the biggest tip. The other tip, and this one is just because I'm a perfectionist, is most tutorials that I've seen, I say most, like there's a ton, I've only ever seen 2. Most tell you that to get your rug started, you should actually, I need different. All right, here we go. You take 2 different colored strands and then you knot them, trying to make sure that as you pull the knot, the colors alternate so that the pattern is the way you want it to be. Then you pull it and you leave it kind of loose. You don't pull it super tight because you'll eventually need to, when you go back around, tuck through this knot. And so this is how they suggest that you start. This is fine. However, this is going to be bulkier than everything else in your rug, because at no point are you ever combining 4 strands like this, well, more than 4, in some places the way it overlaps. And so I noticed it like a sore thumb when I was working on my rug, like that's where the starting knot was, and that bothered me. So I started taking a different approach to starting my rugs. That seems to be working really nicely. Take your strands. Instead of knotting them, roll them over each other a couple times until you have it be kind of stable up there, like so, right? You don't want to do it too many times, because then whenever you're going, because it'll make it wide for one thing and make it weird and bunchy. And then as you're going around, you'll have too many places, like it won't match up the pattern. So I just do it like this. Put it down. It's a little bit trickier to start it this way, but it's not that much trickier, and I think it's absolutely worth the effort. So normally I have a really heavy weight here to weigh this down. Let's see if this will do. So, and then just braid the way you normally would. Over, under, over. Once you get to a certain point, I hope you can see that, it just kind of is a lot easier. It works just as well as the previous method, but without that big ugly knot at the top. You might need to tighten your stitches once you get to a certain point. So I'm kind of being loosey-goosey with this, but I don't want to waste all of your time. All right, so let's pull this forward. So you can see that this is a fairly good looking braid. You know, it follows the pattern here, but it's a little bit looser up here. So you can totally, and I encourage it, tighten it up a little bit. This yellow could be a little bit tighter, going in this direction too. And then maybe this green just a touch to make sure that the knot at the top isn't too loose. There you go. It looks nice and tight and coherent. And now as you're going, when you finally get to the point where you're braiding around and you get to this side, it's just neat. Yellow, green, yellow, green. You can braid normally. Now I said that you could tighten these up, and I mean that. However, it is a delicate balance, and be very careful. In something small like this, you can't really go too wrong, because if you all of a sudden pulled this one like super, super, super tight, it would be apparent from the very beginning that does no longer look super nice. Over here, it's a lot less obvious if you start pulling where things don't look great. About 5 times now, I've been like, that loop's a little bit loose, and then tried to tighten it, and then ruined the rug and had to start over. So if you're, so like right here, this looks a little loose to me, and in fact it is. So I'm going to tighten it up, but I'm going to make sure that I don't, like this seems fine, it's just right here. So I don't want to just start pulling, because I will undo or change the tension of everything back here. So kind of hold it down in one place to make sure that you don't change the tension of too many things. There we go. And now that's nicer. This one I might do too. Normally around the edges is where you're more likely to do this. But and it's a lot easier to do when it's around the edges. This one's looks a little funny because that's where one of the knots is. Where does this go? Oh, it's just this one right here. But you can see how even just in this one little stretch, it gets a little messy, and you have to be really careful. So be very judicious when tightening stitches, and pretty much only do it on the outside, because if you find a stitch here that's loose, you have to trace it the entire way through the entire thing to get to the end where you can actually remove that extra fabric. And in doing so, as you trace it through the entire rug, you will absolutely throw off the tension of everything else. So don't do it here. If you need to make changes, like, look at your rows as you're done with them to make sure that if you need to make changes, you can do it while they're still on the outside, because otherwise it gets super messy. Okay, this has been a really long video, and I'm sorry, but I hope it's useful.